What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafty Workshop video. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to build this bar cabinet or display cabinet or bookcase. Really could be any number of things. It's basically just a nice versatile piece of storage where you can display the things inside rather than having them closed up like a typical cabinet. So these are inset glass doors. That's a first for me, but they went really smoothly. I love the way they came out. And as you probably noticed, I built it out of this purple MDF from Valcromat. I love the way this stuff looks. Really interesting product and gives it a totally unique look. So let's go ahead and get started with the build. I started this project, like I do with all my sheet goods projects, by first breaking down the full sheet into smaller sections using my track saw. If you don't have a track saw, a circular saw and straight edge would also work great here. As I said in the intro, I used this violet Valcromat MDF for this build, and if you've watched a lot of YouTube woodworking, you've probably seen Christiana from Get Hands Dirty, and that's where I first saw this MDF being used. I finally hunted some down here in the US and found a company called Trinity Innovations, which is a distributor of Valcromat, and they'll ship the MDF, and I'll have their website and contact info in the video description. I really think the colored MDF makes the look of this piece, so give them a call if you want to build one of these cabinets. After breaking down the pieces on the track saw, I moved on to the table saw and cut the pieces to their final length. It's important to keep track of which edges are your factory edges here, since you don't want to use the edge you cut with the track saw or circular saw as your reference edge. That edge probably won't be perfectly square, so you want to trim it square as one of the first things you do on the table saw. After making all those cuts, these are the pieces you should end up with, and these are all going to be outlined in the plans if you want to build this for yourself. But you've got the sides, you've got the top and bottom here. This is the back panel. I did have to do this at the same 3/4 inch MDF just to get the color match. Typically you wouldn't make your back panel that thick, but just kind of had to do that on this one. These two are the shelves. This is the center vertical divider that's going to hold the shelves up, and then these are going to be the rails and stiles for the doors. So next I'm going to move to the table saw and cut the dados and rabbets into these side and top and bottom panels, and that's going to be how I assemble this whole cabinet carcass. The two most popular methods for creating dados and rabbets are going to be either the table saw with a dado stack, which is a combination of blades that allows you to adjust the width to perfectly fit the width of the piece that you're going to be housing in the dado slot. The other option would be to use a router table and a router. The router table would be great for the rabbets on the edges. That way you could kind of run these edges up against the fence of the router table, and then you could use a straight edge to get your dados in the center of the panel. So let's go ahead and move over to the table saw and get our dados cut. After getting the dado stack set up in my table saw at the width of 3/4 of an inch, I measured from the fence and centered the dado stack on the top and bottom panels. I set the depth of the cut to 3/8 of an inch using one of these brass setup blocks. Once you have this measurement locked in, it's important to make the cut on both panels at the same time, and it's a good idea to mark which edge you were referencing so that they line up during the assembly later. Next, I moved the fence over and set it up to cut the rabbets on the edges of the side panels. These rabbets should be flush with the edges and should be about 1/2 inch deep. After getting this measurement dialed in, I cut the rabbets on the top and bottom edges of the side panels. Next, leaving the dado setup exactly the same, I cut rabbets into the back edges of the side panels as well as the top and bottom panels, and this is the recess where the back panel will be housed. With all the rabbets and dados cut, I sanded the inside surfaces of all the pieces up to 120 grit before assembly, and then moved on to the glue up. The glue up was pretty straightforward. I just applied glue to all the rabbets and clamped the pieces together. And that's one of the great things about using rabbets for joinery. Things just kind of square themselves up as long as you cut the joinery properly. I decided to leave the center divider for a second glue up, and this definitely made things a little easier with one less part to clamp up. After assembly, I noticed some small gaps left in the dados and rabbets on the cabinet, and to fill these, I made some purple wood filler by mixing sawdust from the MDF with wood glue into a paste and spreading it into any of the gaps. And this is a great trick and gives an almost perfect color match no matter what type of wood you're using. The last pieces to add to the cabinet were these little spacer blocks on the underside of the cabinet, and I made these since I was using hairpin legs on this build, and I was afraid that 3/4 of an inch of material wasn't enough to hold up this heavy cabinet with all of its contents. I added these blocks to be able to use longer screws with the hairpin legs, and I just cut these out of scrap, added a 45-degree bevel to all the edges so that they weren't visible from the front, and then glued and brad nailed them in place on the bottom of the cabinet. The last thing to do on the cabinet was to drill the shelf pin holes, and I made sure to offset these from left to right so that the holes wouldn't go all the way through the center divider. With the cabinet done, I moved on to making the doors. And first I cut the rails and stiles for the doors to length of the miter saw. After cutting the rails and stiles to length, I laid them out and marked which pieces went together. And to assemble these doors, I used dominoes, but dowel joinery would also work great here. And if you wanted to do this the more traditional way, you could use tongue and groove joinery, which you could cut at the router table. Once the joinery was cut, I glued up the doors. After the doors had dried, I needed to cut a rabbet into the inside edges of the doors to accept the glass panels. I did this at the router table and used a 1/2-inch rabbeting bit. You could also do this with a handheld router, it's just a little more stable at the router table. As you can see, the rabbeting bit leaves rounded corners, and I needed to square those up to accept the glass panels. The glass also had some imperfections at the corner where it was cut at my local home center, so I traced the corners onto the MDF and then used a chisel to cut out the MDF to match. And I was really surprised at how well this MDF responded to chiseling. It was actually super satisfying to cut out each layer and watch it pop out. Next, I installed some of these glass retaining clips, which I'll link to in the video description. These hold the glass in place and are easily removable so that the glass can be replaced if it ever breaks. You can see that I also accidentally picked up the wrong combination square to measure in and ended up with an extra set of holes, but luckily it's on the inside of the doors. The next hardware to install on the doors was the inset hinges, which need to be recessed into the inside of the doors. This installation will vary based on your exact hinges, but basically you drill a hole with a Forstner bit to accept the hinge and then add 2 screws to hold the hinge in place. If you don't have a drill press, there are jigs available to allow you to drill these large holes precisely with a handheld drill, and I'll have a link to one in the video description. Next, I marked the hole locations for the door pulls and drilled the holes at the drill press, and I love the way these brass pulls look with the purple MDF. Not to beat a dead horse here, but I know I'll get asked about these, and all of the hardware is listed in the video description below. With all the major hardware installed, I sanded all the pieces up to 180 grit and then sprayed on 3 coats of Endurovar. The edge grain of the MDF really soaks up a lot of finish, so it'll probably take at least 3 coats to get an even finish on the edges, unless you seal the edges beforehand. After the finish dried, I installed the last bits of hardware, including the magnetic latch, which stops the door from closing in too far. Next, I installed the doors by adding the other half of the hinges to the inside of the cabinet. And these hinges are kind of finicky, but luckily they're really adjustable, and I eventually got them dialed in. Once the hinges were installed, I added the door pulls and then put in one of the shelves, using 1/4-inch shelf pins in the shelf pin holes I drilled earlier. The final step in assembly was installing the hairpin legs, and I pre-drilled the holes first for this. I used 1-inch long, super beefy screws to attach them, and they feel really sturdy. Definitely glad I added those extra support blocks earlier. And with the legs attached, the cabinet was done. All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. I'm really happy with the way this came out. It's totally a statement piece with this purple MDF, but I think that makes it look really, really unique. And I love the way the bottles look inside. This was kind of a skill builder for me. It could be a great skill builder for you. I do have plans available if you want to build something like this. Again, it used rabbets and dados for the joinery. It's got inset doors, inset hardware, so lots of things to learn if you've never done a cabinet like this before. Again, the plans will be linked to in the video description below, as well as all the materials and tools I used. Also, I want to say a big shout out to all my Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. Thanks so much for the support. All right, until next time, guys, thanks for watching and happy building.